Hi, I'm Adam Geis.
I'm David Lurch.
We're hosts of the EdTech Distilled podcast, which is a part of the Education Podcast Network.
Shows on the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Teaching While Queer is a podcast for 2S LGBTQ+ educational professionals to share their experiences in academia. Hi, I'm your host, Brian Stanton, a theater pedagogue and educator in New York City, and my goal is to share stories from around the world from 2S LGBTQ+ educators. I hope you enjoy Teaching While Queer. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Teaching While Queer. I am your host, Brian Stanton. My pronouns are he, they. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Michael Gagnon. Hi, Michael. How are you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, as you said, my name is Mike Gagnon. My pronouns are he, him. I am a gay teacher. I currently teach high school English in a suburban district in Connecticut.
In Connecticut. Awesome. I think you're my second person from Connecticut. And I love just kind of like expanding my little map as I interview different teachers. So awesome. When it comes to kind of like your own experience, what was it like for you as a queer youth and a queer student?
That's a long story. That was a long time ago and a long story. So I, came of age in the 70s and the 80s. So I certainly knew that I was different when I was young, probably 6, 7, 8, not really understanding what that meant until I went through adolescence and realized, oh, that's what it means. And I had a lot of trauma growing up. So I'm part of a very large family. I have 8 siblings.
Wow.
Mostly there are 7 boys and 2 girls altogether. So, and my mother died when we were young. So I was just about 13 when my mother died suddenly and unexpectedly. And I knew before then and had mentioned to an older brother that I thought I was gay, and he apparently had mentioned it to my parents, which I didn't know. And then as soon as I had mentioned it, I was like, no, it's just confused. That's all.
Yeah. It's a fleeting thought.
And then my mother died shortly thereafter, and I decided I just couldn't deal with it. I just could not deal with the loss of a parent and trying to figure out who I was. So it was like, I'm just going to put it on the back burner. I'm just not going to think about it and get myself through high school, and sort of kept to myself as much as possible because I couldn't possibly date a girl and think, to me, it would have been wrong. It just never felt right. And I felt like I was doing something bad to a girl if I dated her. So I just dated no one and sort of kept to myself. And then it was in my early 20s that I was like, I can't live this way anymore. And finally decided I really needed to be out. And at that point, when I came out. So as a teenager and as a young person, struggling with the constant feeling of not being a part of something and I self-isolating just out of protection, which left me very much alone. Sorry.
It's all right. We love cat appearances. Hello.
So he will be back and forth because it's almost dinner time for them. So, but it was really difficult, and it was really constantly dealing with the shame. My mother had been a very strict Catholic. My father was not, but and so the sense of shame that I felt, like, oh, my mother had died, and maybe it's because, maybe it's because of me, and all those things that a young person might think when something like that happens, and trying to reconcile those feelings as well, just made it really, really difficult, and feeling, so separated from everybody, and having people, including my own siblings, use slurs and to put me down and, oh, you're a faggot and you're this and you're that, and sort of having to live through that with my own family, not to mention kids at school. So it made it a really difficult time and a really lonely time for me. And, thankfully got through it, and I started to come out and made friends, and my whole world opened up after that. So
Absolutely.
the whole movement of it gets better. If you hold on, it does get better. If you come into your own and you're able to do those things, it does get better. But it was incredibly difficult. And then you're coming of age during the height of AIDS and all of that, and all of the hate that went with that, and you're terrified to get involved with anyone. You're terrified that I'm going to get it and I'm going to die, and that just exacerbated a lot of those negative feelings that you had to work yourself through to eventually come to a place where you finally got acceptance. Worked on acceptance for myself and who I was.
Absolutely. Did you also grow up in Connecticut, or was this somewhere else in the country?
I did. No, I grew up here in Connecticut. It's strange because my father was a blue collar worker. He was a mailman. My mother didn't work, so how he managed to raise 9 kids on a mailman's salary, I'll never know. And I was born in Hartford. We had been raised up until I was 3 in Hartford, and then we had to move, and for some reason ended up in a fairly affluent town. I don't know how they afforded the house in the town, but we were like the white trash of that town. So we were the family you point at and go like, if you don't do well in school, you're going to end up like these kids. Mm-hmm. So and I'll say I probably ended up better than most of them. So I have more education than they probably do, and used to make more money than they did before I became a teacher. So
I definitely hate those moments when like parents try to use other people as examples. This is a silly story, but I was at Disney World with my husband like a decade ago, and it started a downpour, and we didn't bring our jackets, whatnot. We got back on the shuttle to go to the hotel, and this mom was like, if you would have not brought your jacket like I told you to, this is what would have happened. And I was like, it was 100 degrees. The rain made me feel real nice. Like, don't use me as an example. I'm like, it's just so funny how judgmental people can be just from looking at somebody else. And it's something as silly as rain, or something as important as like that family down the street. We don't want to be like them.
Right.
And that definitely has to play into like your own sense of self, I think, as a young person, because you're not living life in a vacuum. You experience that.
And the amount of shame that you carry from it, the amount of feeling like, oh, we're something bad, we're something wrong with us. And I have a very good friend today who actually is friends with somebody who grew up in the neighborhood that I grew up in. And we all got together at one point, and this person was there, and she was talking about like, oh, do you keep in touch with anybody? I'm like, no, it was a miserable experience. I don't, any friends that I had from high school are the 2 or 3 people that I'm still in touch with today, but I'm not interested in anybody else. They certainly were not either kind or interested. I said, besides, all your parents used to say this about us. And she was shocked. She was like, you knew? And I'm like, of course we knew. It's not like you guys, like your parents were secretive about it. They were very right out in the open. I said, what's interesting is none of them ever asked, I wonder what's going on in that house, that these kids are maybe a little wild, or these kids are like, and what happened, especially after my mother died, like, they've just lost a parent. And, here's this poor guy trying to make ends meet with 9 kids and trying to figure it out. It's like, no, you didn't ask that. You just judged, And I'm like, that's the way people are, unfortunately.
It really is. I find that incredibly disheartening, just like in communities. And it's funny because I was so afraid when I moved from California to Texas that there was going to be so much judgment going on. And Texas is an interesting place because Texans will be nice to your face. They will be kind to your face. And then it will be in closed door conversations where they're kind of talking about you. And we had this group of neighbors that was really fantastic when we first moved in. Like the folks across the street treated our daughter like she was a granddaughter. Our neighbors were really great. The neighbors catty corners to us kept inviting us to parties and whatnot. And then we found out after we moved that they hated us. And like we're talking all about everything that we done to modernize our house and all these things and how they hated us. And I was like, oh wow, it's wild, because I think that community is so important and where you live is so important, and you can't just judge a book from its cover. Like I live in the Bronx now in New York City, and my mom saw a Google image when we were telling her about our house. And she's like, there's graffiti 2 houses down. It's like a complete ghetto. And I'm here and I'm like, everybody's so nice and they're looking out for each other. And like, there's a true sense of community. Yeah. And it's like, you can't just look at a picture and decide that's what it is. And that's the same situation with you folks, is that like someone looked at a picture or like a moment in time,
right?
This picture in their brain of a moment in time with you and was like, those are the bad kids. You don't want to be like them.
Right.
It's wild.
Yeah.
Hopefully human nature will get over that a little bit, like the comparison side of things, but I'm sure that's millennia.
Unfortunately, you still see it. You see it in the school environment, that microcosm of the world, and it's still, I think it's human nature. I think it's, one way to build yourself up is to put somebody else down, and to take those differences that you think are less than, and use those as a way of pointing out, like, see, we're on the right side and you're on the wrong side. And I think, we see that in every area of, our society today, where we're still doing that.
Yeah. And how do you see your experiences as a queer youth kind of informing your pedagogy or your teaching? I imagine that, like, not to mention the personal side of things, like your personal life, mm-hmm. growing up during the time period that you did, there was a lot of trauma surrounding that as well. Because I came of age in the 80s and 90s, and so I'm like the tail end of that kind of trauma, but you came of age kind of right in the middle of it. Yeah. So as an educator, how do you see kind of your experiences as a queer person informing how you interact with your students?
I think growing up and dealing with that shame and having to work through it to become the person, that I've become, and realizing, like, there was no purpose to it. That, like, shame doesn't do anybody any good. It's about, when you do actions, it's about responsibility. Was I responsible for them? Was I not responsible for them? What role did I play in them? And therefore, who I am as a person, biologically and physiologically and mentally, the components that go into making us who we are. I'm, as a youth, I wasn't responsible for those. I was in this situation, and how I processed them was a matter of my environment and numerous other things. So I think when I became an educator, I was in corporate America for a long time, left to finally become a teacher, and because it was what I'd always wanted to do. And then started teaching my first or second year in, and kids, it was amazing to me, first of all, that students were asking about your personal life, because I'm like, I would never have done that when I was, like, no one asked teachers anything about them. And suddenly they all are up in your business. And so I actually started teaching, my first 4 years were in Hawaii. And so to have students ask, and, they would ask, like, well, your girlfriend and and I'm like, well, what are you talking about? Well, the person who do you live with? Who do you live with? I said, I live with the person I love. And they're like, well, who's that? I'm like, that's the person I live with. And I turned it into this sort of round thing where I wouldn't really answer the question. And after a couple of years of that, the kids would eventually figure it out. They'd put, like, oh, that's it, and it was fine. It was like, after that, it was dropped and it was no big thing, which was also kind of surprising, because I'm like, really? Okay. And the more that happened was the feeling of, like, I'm tired of having to either play it blank or, play this game so that I'm not just saying the truth. For fear of my job and for fear of how parents and even students might react. With the fact is, you're free to feel any way you want about it, and that's what makes this a free country. But I'm also free to be myself, and so I just decided at one point, I'm not changing. Pronouns are being general. If people ask if kids ask me what I do at the weekend, my husband and I did this, and that's what I'm going to do. And I just decided to do it, and I was like, both in Hawaii and in Connecticut, I am protected by law, at least for now, knock on wood, it stays that way. But even if it weren't, I don't think that I could teach without being just open and being who I am. I'm done being ashamed of it. I'm done with that part of it. No one's going to have that kind of power and control over me ever again. And I don't care what the cost is, because if it costs me my job, it's not a job worth having. So I can't be a good educator. I cannot be talking to students. I teach English and literature. I cannot talk to students about empathy and about understanding perspectives if I'm hiding my own. So it just doesn't work. And so, for me, that just became it. I was not going to pretend for anybody. And, it's the way it is. And I've gotten, pushback for that from parents and people who didn't want their kids in my class. I'm like, then switch them out. I don't know what to tell you. And I'm thankful that I have, to my district or administration credit, they're like, no, that's not an issue to move a student. Like, he's not in there selling it. He's not in there talking about it all the time. If the kids ask him, he's not going to lie to them. And I'm teaching a new class in humanities this year in literature and with seniors, and I'm having a really great time and having really open, honest discussions. And they ask great questions, and I tell them the truth. And they're like, you wouldn't lie to us. I said, if I can't tell you the truth, I'm going to tell you I can't tell you because it would jeopardize my job. And they have yet to do it. Or if they've asked a question that might have, and I decided to answer it, I just am like, we'll see, especially right now where we have quite the target on us lately. So, it's like, I'm done with it. And maybe that comes with age. Maybe it's the fact that, old enough now, that I'm just like, I'm done doing this. Like, no, this is the reality of the world and we all need to accept each other, and you're free to think whatever you want. You're free to not like me for it, but you're here to learn and I'm here to teach, and that's what we're going to do. And generally the majority of all the feedback and interactions with students has been really great. Which says a lot about the younger generation today. And I hope that they stay that way as they get older and push out all of this, crap that's going on.
Absolutely. I think one of the things you mentioned that's like, it's worth repeating is just kind of, if it's a job where I'm going to get fired over this being who I am, then it's not a job worth having. And I think that young people are kind of trained in capitalism, that they feel like they have to accept the job and then be at the job for like a long time. And my mentality is kind of like, accept the job. And if you realize it's not like working, you can look for another job while still having this job. And that's true of educators also. Like, you don't have to wait till the next school year. I guarantee someone's going to have a mid-year contract that they're going to need to fill, especially right now. And it's more worthwhile to keep looking for the place that's right for you than to just kind of grin and bear it,
Yeah, things have been so hard lately. I took the long route to becoming an educator. I wanted to be one ever since I was little. And when I graduated high school, my father said, why would you want to go into teaching? You'll never make any money. You've grown up poor. Like, go, you're good with numbers. You're good with money. Like, go into business. So I became an accountant, and I'm like, yeah. And I lived in New York, and I lived really well and spent a lot of money and, but enjoyed myself and was like, okay. But it was like, I was not fulfilled and not happy. So for me, teaching was, the minute I walked into a classroom, I felt home. And so the hard part about thinking about leaving it or even going to another school is always the fact, like, this is where I still feel like I belong here. And yet in the last 2 years, have not felt like it's been easy to connect with students, have felt like I'm constantly in battle with parents, which is just exhausting, and with community and with politicians. And and even with administration to a certain degree. And I'm like, I just am exhausted by it. And I actually just had I don't know if it works the same way where you teach, but you have your evaluation. And so at the beginning of the year, you have like this evaluation meeting where you set your goals for the year so they know what they're going to evaluate on. So I just had that. And I actually told the administrator, I said, the only reason I'm back this year is because I work with a really great department, and I have a really great department leader, and they're the people I respect. They're the people who look out for me, and I look out for them. And right there, the only thing that got me back in this building this year. And luckily, I'm starting to enjoy my students again and feeling more connected to them, because for the last 2 years I hadn't, because of all of the politics going on and the pushback. So you're right. It absolutely, if that's what makes a difference. And if you can't find it, then at the place you're at, then you need to go and find it somewhere else.
So I'm not currently teaching. When we just decided to move to New York City, we are very fortunate in that we had some rental property that we could sell, and kind of I could choose and find the job that I wanted. And luckily I have found one, and I'm just waiting on that paperwork. But I've heard from a lot of teachers that this year has been harder than the last. And what's wild to me is that from a teacher perspective, 2020 to 21 was bad because of virtual and in-person, and virtual and in-person.
Right.
And then 21, 22 was bad. And then 22, 23 was bad. And now here we are, 23, 24. It's like every year is getting worse since we all went to isolation in the pandemic. And I'm wondering, like, from your perspective, what does that progression look like? Why is this year particularly worse than like last year?
I think the interesting thing was in going through like the hybrid year where we had half of our kids in the building one day, and then they would switch out with the other. So you were teaching online while you were teaching students in the building at the same time. And it was this sort of the challenge of doing that. And yet it wasn't, living through it and looking back at it, it really wasn't that bad. It was just like trying to get used to the whole setup, and it, you can make it work, and dealing with kids who are disengaged and seeing how much they disengage when they're home, and then still being held accountable, for that. And it's like, well, but they're at home. I can't go through the camera, and, and I've had students who are dialing in while they're laying in bed, or they're dialing in from the shower, and you're just like, nope, sorry, bye. Like, this is not something we need. But I think in the last 2 years, the amount, that education has been politicized, but now even more so than ever. And the pushback of the idea of indoctrination, and that you're teaching, to try. And I'm like, if we were indoctrinating your kids, we'd indoctrinate them, especially teenagers and probably middle schoolers, to wear deodorant.
Mm-hmm.
Older teenagers, like, lay off the perfume and the cologne. It's a little much. Why don't you show up on time? Why don't you stay off? Like, we would be indoctrinating them to that, not,
political ideology.
You're worried about us doing it, whether it's about being gay, or whether it's about, racism, or any of those, particular issues and agendas. It's like, no, that's not what we're doing, And I think that breakdown, that lack of being able to have a civil conversation about what a parent wants for their child, and what we provide in public education for them, and why it might not fit exactly what you want, because it's not just about you, it's about the entire public that we're serving. And so constantly feeling like we're targeted, and parents aren't coming to us to have the conversation. They're going online to have it. And that just opens up all of the, insanity that is done online. And so you become the target for people from across the country. So, I mean, suddenly getting emails from strangers that are telling me how horrible I am and the terrible things that we're doing, and especially, like, if it's bad for me as a teacher or my fellow teachers in the department, it's 10 times worse for my department chair, who is really, getting all of the hate mail. And to go through that, it's just, what are we doing this for? It's so then you go through a crisis where you have a lockdown or something like that. And I'm like, this is why this is happening, because we're getting threats from the school, because you aren't doing, you're putting everything online. You're opening the door for all these people to come at us. And what do you think is going to happen? And then you want us to die for your kid. And it's like,
yeah, you're good enough to die for my kid, but you're not good enough to teach them.
Right. So, and I think that's what has made the last 2 years really so difficult.
Absolutely. I think it's frustrating also because there are political groups out there, or individuals, who are targeting teachers. And what drives me crazy is that there's this idea that you can just post like full on personal information online, and then be not liable or accountable for the threats that happen to that individual person because you put their information online. And that's the part that really gets me, where I think that there needs to be stronger laws when it comes to like doxing. People shouldn't be allowed to put your email address or your phone number or your address or even your school district on their TikTok account or Twitter X account, and then have no accountability when it comes to the fact that their followers are now targeting you personally.
Right.
And then that's the thing that gets me too, is that we have to go into these lockdown drills because a school's getting a bomb threat based off of a lips of a TikTok post, right? Like, and then that person that runs that account gets zero accountability. Her followers get zero accountability because they made an anonymous phone call, and now the school's on lockdown.
Yeah.
And that stuff, I think you're absolutely correct, is that this heightened politicization of education has just made it almost impossible to just do your job.
So we had an incident last year over a vocab list and a book that was being taught. We're having a similar incident this year because the book is still being taught. And one of the things that happened was we all had to sit down and go over the controversial topics policy for the district, and was being led by an assistant superintendent who was going through it. And they were like, let's list out what we call controversial topics, and, racism and, LGBTQ plus. And over the course of the conversation, I simply said, so, with all due respect, what you're saying is that I shouldn't be an out teacher. And he's like, that's not what I'm saying. I'm like, but that is what you're saying. I said, you don't realize that's what you're saying. I don't think that you personally are intending to say that, but that is what you're saying. I said, because you're listing me as a controversial topic. I'm not a controversial topic. That's just my life every day. And that's offensive. It's offensive to me. It's offensive to students in here that you're telling them that they aren't like everybody else. They're controversial in some way. And that's a problem. And if parents can't see that, shame on them.
And Black teachers and Mexican teachers and anybody of color. And It's like, if you're going to list these things as controversial topics, then literally what you're saying is that these people aren't okay. Like, we can only teach about white straight people. And if they had their druthers, it would be white straight Christian people. And so I think the erasure in these policies from an administrative standpoint is probably not intended.
Right.
But it's happening.
Right.
Whether they like it or not.
And I said it afterwards because he got very emotional afterwards, and he was talking to me. He said, if something like that were to happen, I would, lay down my job for you. And I'm like, that's nice of you to say, but would you? Because I don't know. You're asking me to trust you, and that's hard to do right now. And I said, and if it's not you, it certainly is the board who certainly feels that way. So, and they're ultimately who we all work for. So maybe this isn't the district for me. And you have no idea how much that hurts to say.
Yep. Parents, if you're a parent who listens to this podcast, please run for your school board, because we need more folks who are willing to accept that different types of people exist and should be represented in the classroom, bare minimum, on the school boards.
Or if you're a parent with a high school level child, get an active PTA going where we start to have conversations again, because that's what's missing. And by high school, elementary school, you've got these vibrant, robust PTAs where parents are, going in and making parties and doing cookies. In middle school, they're still kind of fairly active, but suddenly you get to high school and there's really no PTA. There is, but they don't really do anything, or at least certainly not in my district, and they should. We should have a robust group that is a conversation between parents and teachers. And, that way we understand one another. We're on the same side. We're trying to do the same thing. It just, we're going about it in the way that we understand education. You're coming at it from a parent. We need to find ways to cooperate together.
Absolutely. And I would encourage people also that if you truly believe that there's indoctrination happening, like, don't take a meme or a picture or an online conversation as all of the truth. Like, go to the classroom that your kids are in and find out what's happening. Like, as long as you're not disruptive, you'll be able to access the class.
Absolutely.
And what you might find is you might find a rainbow flag and zero conversation about it.
Right.
Because that's not what we're doing at school. You're teaching English. I'm teaching theater. Like, that is what we do. We are teaching our core subject, not our political ideologies. And just because we have a flag up in our room doesn't mean that we're teaching and telling people that's how it has to be. I mean, it's not like we're going in and being like, you can only like Yankees because I have a Yankees flag in my room.
Right.
Like, there's so many colleges, like especially in Texas, all of the like A&M versus UTs and all that stuff that happens, that competitiveness, we're not going into the room and being like, well, in this classroom, you only like UT Austin. In this classroom, you only like A&M Corpus Christi. Like, that's not what it's about. It's about showing up and showing who you are as a teacher and just letting that live there and be there.
They ask about my weekend. My husband and I did this, and then we move on. And they certainly don't seem to be thinking about it any more than I am. Sometimes they have more questions, like what's my husband do, or stuff like that. But it's usually a very short conversation. Then we move on. It's like that we're here to work on literature. Let's do our job, right? And I don't think that it's not this sort of like come and join the club. It doesn't work that way. I had a parent once to a student who had come out to me and had been talking to me, and they had told their parent when they came out to their parents that I've been talking to Mr. Gagnon, and the parent at one point wanted to know, did I encourage it in any way? And then later had a conversation with the parent, and I said, it doesn't work that way. It's not. I said, if it did, there would be thousands of suddenly gay children running around. It doesn't work that way. And I said, I just am who I am. And it gave him the comfort level to come and talk to me. I'm really proud of that. And I'm really proud that he felt comfortable enough to do it. And that got him to talk to you. And that makes your relationship better. And ultimately, that's the goal, And I don't want them to feel ashamed about who they are. The first thing I always say when a student comes out to me is like, the first thing you need to realize is you're okay.
Yep.
You're okay just the way you are.
There's nothing wrong with you.
Nothing wrong with you. And this is your journey. You're gonna figure out the way you want it to play out. And just know that I'm here if you need to talk it through. And that's it.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the thing that I think of, and this circulates the internet a lot, every couple of years. But if it were a choice, why would we choose the hatred and the targeting and whatnot? Like, if it were truly a choice, what in your right mind thinks that someone would choose to live in all of this animosity?
Right.
And I think that it would be, this is a lot to ask, for people to take a breath and use a little bit of logic to determine that maybe some of the things that they're saying aren't exactly logical.
Right. Again,
why would I choose to be targeted by an entire religious group if I had the choice?
But fear isn't logical.
Yep.
Sadly, it's not. And
I'm also confused about what are you afraid of? Because it's not like the straight people are dying; it's the queer people who are dying. What are you afraid of, queer or straight people? Like
looking into it, of thinking that maybe you're wrong, maybe what you've learned is wrong. I mean, it's hard to. I think that's a big thing for parents and why I think the whole thing about indoctrination and education is at such a high right now is the feeling like you're turning my kid against me, and it's like education just gives people access to information. Ultimately, it's going to take them wherever it takes them. And the fact is, like, well, every child sort of has a moment or in time where they turn against their parents because they need you. They need to break free. They need to find out who they are. And eventually that sort of weaves its way back into, because you're their parent. Like, the same way my father made tons of mistakes, but he was my father. It was just sort of, it's the nature of the relationship. And
I would love to like meet that person who's had the perfect parent-child relationship their entire life, because I honestly feel like as a parent, I'm like, oh, it doesn't exist.
I have to say, mine was, despite all the issues, mine was actually pretty good. I mean, when I came out, my father was amazing. So I give him a ton of credit for a man who had only a high school education and he was very self-taught. And when my brother told him, when I was, shortly before my mother died, that I thought I was gay, he spent my adolescence reading everything he could get his hands on to try and understand. And so by the time I was ready to come out, he was like, okay. When you come out, you're like ready. You're ready for the fight. You're ready to be like, no, we're going to argue about this. And no, it was no argument. That's okay. And I said, no, if I'm dating someone, I want to bring them home. I want you to treat them the way you would treat my brother's girlfriends. Or, oh, okay. And it's like, what do you mean, okay? Like, I'm ready to.
I have my boxing gloves on.
And that's the way he was. And he was, literally, and when he was dying, and we were in the hospital. My husband was standing off to the side, and he was like, get in here. You're part of this family. And it's like, that's very much who he was. And that's where I get my sensibility from. That's where I get my sense of empathy and care from. So despite, again, there were lots of things he was responsible for and made tons of mistakes, but boy, when it came to the really tough stuff, he did, especially, when I was coming of age. I think he made a lot of my mistakes with my older siblings. So I was like, they might have a different take on him than I do, but it was like, yeah, you did it right for me. And that, that means everything. So
that's awesome. And that's it. And really, parents, that's what it is just being there for your child. And if you don't know something or something scares you, like, just learn about it.
Right.
Because that knowledge and learning will ease some of that fear.
Right.
And as a parent, you're always going to have fear. I mean, that's just the nature of being a parent. But like, it'll lessen it to just learn a little bit about what you're worried about.
And I think, the sad part is you've got 95 to 99% of the parents that I really deal with are amazing. They're good, solid, good people. And yes, they have questions or we may have disagreements on things, but they're really good people. And it's that small percentage that just, they get all of the air, they get all of the, attention because they demand it. And it's too bad that sort of paints a picture of parenting as a whole, because I don't think in general that's truly what it is.
And really, you're right in that, like, this 5% or even like 1% to 2% of parents, they get all the headlines.
Yep.
They are the loudest voice in the room. And so therefore people think that they're the majority, but really it's like 1% to 2% of parents that we're having this issue with. And yet it's impacting like 100% of minority teachers.
Right. Absolutely.
So thinking about that, if you were to talk to a new teacher, someone going into the classroom for the first time, what advice would you give to them about being their authentic self in the classroom?
I think the key is always to remember it's your own journey. And so you have to decide where you're at in that journey and what's going to work for you. Multiple things play into how your authenticity looks because of, what's the age of the children you're teaching, what's the environment that you're teaching in, what state are you in, what district are you in, what's the political climate like in that area. And I think in the end, it's, you decide what your journey is. You make the steps that you feel like you're comfortable making. And, as we were talking about earlier, if it isn't comfortable and it isn't working for you, then go somewhere else. Find somewhere else to be, because it's, you need to be in a place where you are going to be able to be your most authentic self, because that is going to inform the way you teach. You cannot teach in a guarded state all the time. When you're that heightened, you're just not going to be a great teacher, because you're not going to connect with students, and that feeling of disconnection, just having it over the last couple of years was very jarring and very like, how do I do this? Because I'm so guarded in the classroom because of what's happening around me, not because I'm suddenly not out, but because I'm just very aware of what's happening. And so I'm being mindful when I say things in a way that I usually don't. And so now this year, I think I'm getting back into like, I'm going to be me. And if people are going to come for me, they're going to come for me. And I can't do anything about it. So I think, especially as a new teacher, those first 5 years are rough enough as it is. Choose the path that's going to allow you to have the most success and the most comfort. And let it be okay. Don't go by what anyone else says or what anyone else thinks that you should do or be. In the end, you'll decide what it is for yourself and what that looks like in your classroom. Just don't, my one don't would be, don't do anything that gives you a sense of shame.
That part right there.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then what would you like to see the academic community do to be better support for LGBTQIA plus students and teachers?
I would like to see them be more vocal at this time in a meaningful way of creating conversation with real parents. And when I say real parents, I mean not that 1 or 2% who's turned it into the political agenda, even though they act like they don't, but with real parents, and to really talk about how do we provide your child with access to an understanding of the diverse world they're going into, so that they have the empathy and the wherewithal to navigate that world in a meaningful way that doesn't take away from their own experience and at the same time doesn't take away from anybody else's, because ultimately that's what we want, a society that allows people to live to their fullest potential, whether you agree with that path for them or not. And so we need to find a better way of doing it, and being vocal and pushing back and saying we're not going to cave on these particular things because they're wrong. It's one thing to have a conversation and say, what alternatives do we have? I mean, as an English teacher, a parent always has the right to say, I don't want my child reading that book. Okay, let's find an alternative. The best experience I ever had was a parent who said, if you tell me like what other books you could give them, I'll read them. And she read every single book that I said, well, I thought maybe this book or this book or this book. She read them and came back and gave me great feedback on which ones would be great. And, it was just because the book we were reading just had a Holocaust book just had some really graphic detail that I'm not trying to deny what it is to my child. We just don't do anything that's sort of rated R until they're 18. So if you could, I'm like, we'll find something that's less graphic. Could you read these 3 books? And she read them and came back and we found a book that worked, and that's what we did. And it was like, that's what it should be. And so we need to, and our administration and our academic peers need to be doing that work and creating those environments. And the same thing for parents. Like I said, that active PTA of where we sit at the table and we talk about what are the concerns and what are the realities of education. Because I often think a lot of your concerns about what happens in a classroom, you should come and stand in our hallways and in our libraries and in our cafeterias and hear the way your kids talk and what they talk about, and what they say to each other, and the way they talk to teachers. Because if you think your kid doesn't know it, and even if your child is one of the ones who isn't saying it, they are surrounded by that all day long. And that's not even talking about social media. So, that message has got to get out there about, here's the reality of what your kids are really dealing with every day. Because I don't think parents even have the slightest clue. And it's not because I think they want to be ignorant. I think it's simply because, like everybody else, they're going to work, they're trying to, manage their lives. And so we need to do a better job of all around of having those conversations and getting those conversations to happen, or else this is just going to continue to spiral.
Absolutely. There's so much packed into that I just really appreciate. So I'm glad that this moment existed. Yeah. So at this point, I want to turn the mic over to you, and we always cap the interview with you asking me a question. So take it away.
Well, what made you go from being in the classroom to doing this?
Well, I chose to do this because I was having a hard time with conservative groups targeting me. I was the teacher of the year for my school district in a conservative, or what perceived conservative district. But again, it's like that 1% to 2%, but that 1% to 2% was also made up of very affluent people. And so I was being targeted because of that, in a way that, like, my family, we moved to the district. I had thought I was going to be there for a long time. So we moved so that my daughter was like across the street from her elementary school in the same school district. And it got to a point where I needed to leave because I felt like if I'm being targeted at some point, it's going to be that my children are targeted. Mm-hmm. So I left the district and stewed on this idea of, like, I didn't have a place to share my story. And so I am now here, started the podcast a year later because that place never popped up. And I was like, I'll give myself a year. If it pops up, I'll ask to interview. If it doesn't pop up, I'll just create it. And so I did. And part of it, like, a part of this is research based. Like, I am a theater pedagogue, but my research areas are universal design for learning, so making things accessible for everybody, and queer theater, which means I do a lot of queer theory. Mm-hmm. And so part of this is that I just like information, and I like talking with people, and I like to present about, I have full-on presentations about this podcast that I take to educational conferences, talking about experiences that teachers have. And I'll, a teacher from Canada said this, and it's very vague stuff, but it's like, these are the real life situations that queer teachers are experiencing in the moment. And I decided to take a break from the classroom, one, because moving to New York City has always been a dream of mine. And so when we moved here and my husband and I realized that we had the financial ability for me to move and kind of take a break, and I have not taken a break since I was 18, I was like, this is a chance, I've been working hard for the last 20 years. This is a chance for me to take, I said a school year. It turns out that I'm taking like 5 months because I like to work. Right. I like what I do. And so I have a position that I'll working at a university to do like technical direction for the theater department, which means I'm responsible for all of the lights, the sound, building sets, costumes, all those things. And that includes teaching the lab classes in their technical theater program. But I'll also have the opportunity to teach adjunct classes for theater education, where I get to kind of focus on that universal design for learning and how do we go teach these things in high school settings. And so I have always dreamed of working at a university and really thought that it was going to take a long time. I, like you, went into the corporate world. It was just corporate entertainment, and was there for 15 years before I started teaching 5 years ago. And so I got to what I wanted to do the long way. And now I get to do this and I get to do that. And it's kind of feeding two different sides of my personality and really filling a space that needed to be filled. Because my goal is, in all this chaos, that our voices will never be 100% silenced. Because this podcast will exist and will continue to exist throughout all this kind of turbulent time. I think I used that term in my emails to people too. I was like, due to the turbulent nature of politics right now, you're welcome to be anonymous if you want. And we have some people who are going to be coming up on the podcast who are anonymous because these 1% to 2% of parents impact 100% of the minority teachers in the nation and really around the world, because it's not isolated. The stuff that's happening here is happening other places.
Right. I think people are often really shocked, like, especially like in Connecticut. I'm like, it's everywhere. It's not just, yes, you think Connecticut's a more liberal state, but, it exists everywhere. So. It
exists everywhere. And maybe it's just shifted slightly. There's certain, like, for instance, you might find places where there's more anti-Semitic behavior as opposed to really racial disparity. And so, but these things are happening everywhere for any teacher in a minority situation. And I've talked to teachers from France and Canada, and I had a person who wanted to interview from Australia, but our timing just never worked out. But in their pre-interview questions, they said that they are dealing with the same situations we're dealing with in the US in Australia. So it's really a worldwide problem that we're experiencing. And unfortunately, no one's found the solution. No one has the answer to how to fix it all. We're just kind of dealing with this rocky pendulum swing that hopefully will get back to a place where we're progressing towards inclusivity.
Right. In some way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Hey, Mike, I really enjoyed our time today, and I just want to thank you for being on the podcast and sharing your story.
I'm really grateful that, that you responded and that I was able to be included, because I think it's really important. And I think the more that we get our voices out there, like you said, and keep ourselves being heard and tell our stories and let other educators know they're not alone who are going through it, that they have people they can reach out to, and that, those who are thinking about go into it with a little bit more of their eyes wide open, but at the same time know that they also have supports in place and they should demand supports as well.
Yep. No matter who you are, just know that you're not alone. There, especially in this virtual world that we live in, there is access to other people who will help support you.
Absolutely.
Thank you all for listening at home. Have a great day. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Teaching While Queer. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Leave a review, and that would help out tremendously. You can also support the podcast by going to www.teachingwhilequeer.com and hit support the show. Thanks so much, and have a great day.